My name is Kenneth Pruitt. I'm the Vice President for Global Centers. And for any of you who were here this morning, you've already heard my one joke. I'll tell it again. It won't sound nearly as funny the second time. We do start on time. We only have 50 years to finish this project, and I don't want to be late getting started on it. Just a word or two by way of introduction. For those of you who just joined us, the president of Columbia University has said very clearly, and I think correctly, that he does not believe that any university can be a great university or even a serious university in the 21st century, which is not a global university. Having said that, however, he didn't give us the next sentence and define exactly what a global university was. And that's obviously a conversation that this entire university has to have with itself and with its colleagues around the world and so forth. We started that conversation this morning. We continue it now with, in effect, perhaps the three most important persons connected to Morningside Heights, with respect to obviously the undergraduate in particular teaching programs, but certainly specifically with respect to the undergraduates. And one of the things that's been asked of me about the global centers, and I won't describe them in detail today, but I was asked this morning, at what point will we be on all of the major continents? And that will happen within a year. We are relatively certain that we will open a center in Nairobi in the fall and in Santiago, Chile in the spring, which will then bring us to 7 centers, one in South Asia, one in East Asia, one in the Middle East, one in Europe, one in Istanbul, and then Africa and Latin America, and of course, North America. We think of this as a global center. The other thing I want to emphasize is, especially before this panel speaks, is that many, many times I've been asked, other people who have been connected to this project have been asked, what's the strategy with respect to undergraduate education? What are the ways in which we're going to involve undergraduates in the planning of the programs, and what are the ways in which we imagine that they will have their curricular and their intellectual lives altered by this process? To which my answer is we're just starting the hard thinking on that, and today's panel is a very, very powerful statement about the fact that we're getting started on it. So without a lot more introduction, I do want to take a word to say thank you to some people. I won't go down the list at great length. Many people helped put this event together, but 4 in particular who happen to be sitting up here in the front row. Xun Zhengji, Xunji Zhang, Etan Smith, Reto Hoffman, and Christy Kelly. You've seen on the program that something called Interact helped do that. The name Interact, it describes a postgraduate program, and these are the 4 postgraduates who are part of that program this year, and they took on this task of trying to think through, conceptualize, help design, recruit people for the program. So they are the people I thank. Many other people worked on it, but these are the people who really gave the leadership. We'll get started then with President Deborah Swartz.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you all for being here. This is a great topic. It's a huge topic, obviously, and it's a pleasure for me to be able to cross the street and say a few words about globalization from the perspective of Barnard College. I have to say that in my past life, I actually was a professor, still occasionally get to pretend to be a professor, but everything I taught was about international. I taught international politics, international economics, international law, international politics and economics, sort of anything that had international in the topic in the title, I got to teach. So this is a subject that I've spent many, many years thinking about. And I have to say that after all these years, I've really come to hate the word globalization. I hate the word because everybody, oh, thank you. Everybody throws it out all the time. And I don't think there's ever any agreement on what the heck we're actually talking about when we talk about globalization. And I occasionally think that we have this sort of image of one of those old Pepsi commercials in the back of our mind where everyone's holding hands in a pretty field and singing about the future. But I don't think we actually spend nearly enough time describing what we mean by globalization. And I felt this very much in my own life change. I spent many years at Harvard Business School where globalization was a good thing about multinationals based in the US taking over the world. And that was a good thing. I showed up at Barnard College and I realized that globalization had a very different meaning amongst my faculty. And so I'm careful about how I use the word, but I really do think it is such a major word. We hear it all the time, we see it in the papers, we talk about it, we tout it. We really have to think about what we mean by it. And clearly it doesn't have just one meaning, it has many meanings, but I think it's critical to actually parse the meanings and talk about what are the objectives that any given group or institution or organization is actually working towards. Having said that, I really do firmly believe that there is no single model by which a university, even a great top-tier university, can or should be going global. I think this is actually a wonderful area in which to follow the wisdom of Chairman Mao and let 1,000 flowers bloom. And let every university, whether they be US-based or anywhere else in the world, think about globalization in terms of their own definition and in terms of their own style of how they want to go global. So even if you just look in this great city here, the model that NYU has chosen is fundamentally different from the model that Columbia has chosen, which is very different from what Barnard has chosen as a small subset of Columbia. And I think this is actually an area where we can relatively comfortably not compete and actually just let different schools, different leaders think about what makes most sense for their campus and their constituency. Having said that, I'm just going to focus my brief remarks around the following dichotomy. And with apologies, I did spend a lot of my life as an economist. I think it's useful to think about universities and international expansion, if you will, in terms of either an export or an import model. I think they're two very, very different models. In the export model, briefly speaking, what we as American universities tend to do is we take what we do and what we know and we share it with others. It's really equivalent to the American multinational strategy. Here are our systems and our processes. We're going to export them to the rest of the world with, quietly, the suspicion that what we do is better than what the rest of the world does. And therefore, our sharing is really benevolence on our part. The other possibility, of course, is an import model, which, just following the economic parallel, would be much more about truly taking from the rest of the world, buying from the rest of the world, and looking for the comparative advantages that other parts of the world might have in the field of education. And without being too gloomy here, I think the history of international trade over the past half century might offer some parallels that we want to be aware of. There was a long period of time in which we as Americans presumed that we would always be the dominant car manufacturer, the dominant television manufacturer, the dominant manufacturer of semiconductors. We never thought that we might become an importer in those sectors. And yet, in all the sectors I've just mentioned, the United States is now an importer. So I think we want to keep these two models and the preconceptions that go along with them sort of buried somewhere in the back of our head. So what do I mean by saying the U.S. has had an export focus in education? Well, an export focus is about setting up campuses abroad. You literally, at some level, almost take the bricks and mortar, you take the faculty, you take the textbooks, you pick them up, and you put them down in another place. That's an export model. And you make money from doing it, quietly. But in an export model, you generally make money. In the export model, sort of at a smaller level, but in fact, in terms of dollars, it's a larger level right now, We bring students from outside the United States to the United States. We are, in terms of balance of payments terms, every time a non-American student signs up to go to an American university, the U.S. is actually exporting educational services. And it is not an insignificant item on the U.S. balance of payments. In fact, it really is. Education is quite a large item. You can't always find it. It'll show up as services. But if you just even look around the room and look around the students at this university, we're exporting education. We also export, and I don't have numbers on this, but I think they're quite substantial, textbooks. We export our educational materials by selling textbooks, now online materials, all kinds of information, knowledge that is manifested in a particular educational format, and we send those abroad. And as I said, all of these are actually rather large export items. What would an import model look like? And just, I think the possibilities here are a little bit more subtle. If we are, and I think the global centers to some extent do fall into an import model, if we go abroad just to be a consumer of information, to learn, to do research, to improve our knowledge base, it's very different than the export model. That's much more, I'm stretching the definition a little bit here, that's an import model. We're importing knowledge, we're importing information. If we send our American students to study abroad, obviously that's an import model as well. And at the risk of being provocative, I would suggest here that as we move further and further along this pathway, we may and probably should want to start thinking much more seriously about study abroad programs. To what extent are they fun and games in the sun? Not that any of our students would do that, but other colleges might have students who would really see this as a vacation service rather than an educational service. If we really want to import knowledge and import different educational models, we have to do study abroad very seriously, so that it's really about learning about a different country's systems, its policies, its norms, its rules, and not just about tourism, which is quite different. And then finally, and this is just a bit one of my pet peeves, so I'd like to put it out there. The United States has arguably moved away from importing foreign languages, if you will. We're cutting back on the study of foreign languages, which kind of belies a presumption that we can export what we do in English around the world, rather than saying we will go out there, learn about other countries, other cultures, other policies in the language in which they are being carried out. I was somewhat stunned last night. This is one of these things that could only happen in New York. I was at a Seder sitting next to an Iranian Ayatollah. You know, nowhere else does this happen. But this very, very intelligent Iranian Ayatollah, he's actually moved away from being an Ayatollah and now works for a think tank. But he was saying to me, because he's, as you can imagine, been on television quite a lot recently, that he is constantly stunned by the number of American academics commenting on what's happening in places like Iran who don't speak the language. And that worries me a lot. So let me just hazard 3 predictions. I don't have a very good crystal ball, but 3 things that I can imagine we might see unfolding over the next little while. I suspect that the U.S. financing model of higher education is going to become less sustainable over time. Just as you can argue that the U.S. model of automobile manufacturing became less sustainable over time. If you look at what's happening in particular in China and India, where they have much more a model of state-financed education, I think that model is going to become increasingly powerful as our model, for reasons that are not directly relevant to today's conversation, as our model becomes harder and harder to sustain. Maybe not at places like Columbia and Barnard, but as you start going more broadly across the landscape of U.S. higher education, the fact that college tuition is at the level of $50,000 a year is going to become, I suspect, much less sustainable over time. And at the moment when we have universities in the United States that are arguably better than those anywhere else in the world, people will come to us at $50,000 a year. As the other countries catch up in their educational programs and keep their prices lower, I think that dynamic is going to shift. I also suspect, again at the risk of being somewhat gloomy, that the U.S. model of the, quote, college experience will become less defensible. Students go to college for many things right now, but it's not only just about the education. They're getting a whole other range of experiences built into that education. And that's wonderful as long as you can afford it. But as the economy remains constrained, I think we're going to see people less interested in paying for the experience or even having the experience, and more interested in purely the educational pieces. On the flip side, though, I suspect that the U.S. liberal arts model of undergraduate learning will become increasingly desirable around the world, and actually not that easy to replicate. I'm sure you've been seeing it at Columbia. We're having many, many delegations of folks from around the world really intrigued in trying to replicate the undergraduate liberal arts model, and it's hard. Because I think this precious gem we have is really pretty deeply embedded in the U.S. educational system, in the U.S. political system, in the U.S. ideological system. That is going to be harder to translate, not everywhere, but many parts of the world. Even parts of the world like the United Kingdom, which we think about as being intellectually and politically very close to this country, can't quite get their arms around the idea that 17-year-olds might not know what they want to be when they grow up. So I really do think we have a very precious model here, and I suspect, to use the economic term, this will remain a comparative advantage for the U.S. educational system. So let me just conclude by saying what we're doing at Barnard. I guess I've been somewhat unfair. As I said, my whole background has been in international, so since I've come to Barnard, I've picked up the trajectory that was already there to make the college more global, and have run with it perhaps more energetically than I should have. But I really do think it's important to start a whole series of programs around these international topics. One of the things that we've done that has been fabulously successful, and I say that this was not something I created, is a program with a great objective and a horrible name. It's called VISP, the Visiting International Scholar Program. And I always joke, if any donor is in the room and you want to give me the money, I will name it whatever you want. But for the moment, we call it VISP. And what VISP is it's really study abroad in reverse. It's not an exchange program. It's not a one-for-one exchange. But we've signed agreements with now, I believe, 10 universities around the world. 3 in China, 2 in Korea, 1 in South Africa, 1 in Ghana, several in Europe, 1 in Australia. And they send us their juniors for 1 semester. They vet the students. We then double vet them, particularly for their English competencies. And they come as fully fledged members of the Barnard-Columbia community. They get advisors, they get mentors, they get buddies, they can take whatever classes they want, and we basically don't charge them tuition. It has been a phenomenally successful program for us. We have 60 of these students on campus right now, and what they serve to do is partly they're ambassadors for the college back to their home countries. They also serve, though, to internationalize our juniors who don't study abroad. Like many colleges, we have a ton of students who go abroad junior year and a ton who can't. And so the juniors who stay on campus now, they tend to get roommates from China, Korea, Ghana, and it's really been, thus far, an incredible experience all around. We've also launched a series of global symposia, and this started as serendipity, really with conversation with Ken, when Columbia launched its global center in Beijing. Ken and Lee were kind enough to invite me to come along. And once I knew I was coming, I put my head together with some of my colleagues and said, you know, we should do something else while we're in Beijing. And we discovered an amazing alumna who had graduated from Barnard exactly 100 years before the opening of the research center, a woman named Kang Tong-pi, who had been the first Chinese woman at Barnard, who then went back and, along with her father, Kang Yuwei, were major reformers in China, particularly around the question of foot binding. So we had a symposium in her honor on women changing China. And it was really a glorious success. And so we replicate this once a year in a different part of the world. So we were in Dubai in 2010. We just came back from Johannesburg last month, and we'll be going to Mumbai next year. And the idea is we're trying to do this more as an import model than an export model. We don't bring many of our faculty along, and our faculty do not come as speakers. Instead, we try to highlight the amazing women in that part of the world, provide a forum, which they don't have very frequently, to talk about women's issues and women's status. And then we try to capture their stories and bring them back to our students and our faculty. And this year we were lucky enough, we had the funds to bring 6 students with us. We partnered up with a local high school. We had 80 high school girls working with our students the day before on leadership issues, and it was just a wonderful intergenerational exchange, and we hope to keep this model going. And finally, I should point out one of my colleagues, Kadavari Bakshi, has also been done some very, very innovative work with your center in Amman, working on bringing a group of architecture students over to do some fascinating architectural projects in Jordan. So we're delighted to piggyback on what Columbia is doing, and then we are proceeding with these efforts of our own. So let me just leave you with 3 questions that hopefully will provoke some thoughts in your own mind. To go back to where I started about what this word globalization means, I think we each have to ask ourselves how global our students need to be. And when we say global, first of all, how are we defining it? But how do we think about the trade-offs between breadth and depth? Do we want each student to have some deep knowledge of some part of the world or some aspect of the world outside their own home country? Or do we want them to have a thinner but broader sense of life, culture, programs around the world? Similarly, how global does our faculty need to be? Should we be sending each and every faculty member abroad for at least a semester? Should we demand that all faculty in all disciplines have some comparative national perspective to their work? I don't know, but I think we need to think about that. And then finally, and this is the question I've always struggled with, are we, and we here, I mean all American universities, are we in the end really trying to build a global university or a distinctly American college, because that's what we are, that seeks to serve and understand an increasingly global world? It's a subtle distinction, but I think it's really critical. So let me end there. Thank you again for having me, and I look forward to your thoughts.
I won't directly let Deborah answer this question, but I will pose it out loud just for fun. I'm sitting here listening and trying to figure out what is the relationship between Columbia and Barnard with respect to export-import.
We have trade figures.
Good. Peter Ahn, as you know, is Dean of General Studies. Peter. Great. Ooh.
Thank you very much. It's really a delight to be here. When I began on the faculty at Columbia, and I should explain that I'm professor of Islamic religion and comparative religion, I began at Columbia in 1978. And when I began, in the United States, the study of Islam, if it existed at all, was relegated to courses on Eastern religion. Now, of course, you ask the question, east of what? And then you ask, how in the world can an intellectual tradition that is steeped in Hellenism and the philosophical tradition shared by medieval Europe, that it would end up in a course on Eastern religion? And it became clear Eastern represented anything we didn't know and that we knew nothing about. It was stuff that was exotic, and that was in the realm of the exotic, that which we kind of enjoyed, but didn't need to take seriously. Well, over 30 years later, the world is radically different. We talk endlessly about the internationalization of business, of communication, but what is most important for us is the challenge to, yes, celebrate what is incredibly valuable about the liberal arts model of undergraduate education, but also to come up with those opportunities and engagements, both humanly and intellectually, that allow American students and students from around the world to truly become world citizens, to promote their own professional careers, but also to promote a more sophisticated understanding of the world in general. But that is not an easy challenge to meet. And it is one, I think, that we're grappling with in terms of how we go about engaging. And I would again emphasize, it has to be a human engagement, not just an intellectual one. I mean, my ideal would be to be creating engagement on a human level that has an essentially critical intellectual component to it. And so as we look at the undergraduate curriculum at a place like Columbia, a curriculum of which we are immensely proud, we might have to think quite seriously about reaching out in a certain number of very important courses to literally integrate students from around the world. Using technology that exists to literally have undergraduates in the same class without necessarily having to transport them physically from one place to another. I also think that there has to be a willingness to engage language. Now, I may be a bit old hat on that, but if you can't function within a society through language and culture, I think one's experience is limited. I think the seductiveness of, oh, well, English is becoming the international language is, I think, misguided. Because even if vast numbers of educated men and women can engage you in English, you're not taken quite as seriously as you would be were you able to engage them as well in their own language, which is the entree into a local culture. And so it is curricularly that we are challenged. It isn't, again, simply layering courses one on another, which unfortunately I think has been the model in the past, when we discovered areas that, oh, well, we had neglected or needed to integrate. Well, you just add more courses on top of what already exists. Or, as we have here, an elaborate general education program. Well, how much more can one layer on top of what already exists? A small anecdote. I taught one of the core courses, Literature Humanities, for 2 decades. And for the first decade, I fought bitterly and usually unsuccessfully to get the faculty to integrate some issues relating to Islam. As the course was designed, you moved from St. Augustine to Thomas Aquinas to Dante. And I would ask, didn't something happen in between? But again, this isn't to say, oh, how terrible things are. It is your natural instinct is to focus on those intellectual foundations of your own culture. And Islamic thinkers were never overtly part of that in the modern period. And so to get that notion of curricular integration within courses themselves is a much, much harder challenge than just layering course upon course upon course. Columbia students now have an array of ways of engaging intellectually, cultures different from their own, but they don't have the time to do it all. So how can we create the kind of creative curricular development that allows people to engage within the context of the limited time they have and all of the various things that they have to accomplish as undergraduates? I'm also very, very committed to trying to work with students as well as the administration to be able to create opportunities for students to engage students at other universities around the world in terms of workshops, small conferences that could be designed and facilitated by students while they are in their own countries, and then use the global centers as a place in which to assemble people for this. I'm going to try to do something similar since I'm in the center in Amman in Jordan, with which I have very deep relationships, to try to, again, engage a core development group here among the students to say, what would you be interested in creating in terms of a mini program that could occur in the winter semester, it could occur during spring break, it could occur during the summer, that allows you to actually sit down and grapple with an idea that is relevant both to students from the Arab world and Israel, as well as students from the United States. And who knows, there might be Europeans equally interested in engaging this. And I think President Spar was quite articulate in pointing out that this is not a kind of colonial enterprise presented in a more elegant dress. This isn't, as the French colonial enterprise argued, une mission civilisatrice. We're not here to civilize the world. Rather, you have to take your interlocutors absolutely and deadly seriously, as people as bright as you, as engaged as you, who may come at the question from a very different perspective, but who have to be respected as equals in this shared intellectual endeavor. And so we have to build substantive relationships with students on the undergraduate level and institutions who are willing to experiment as we experiment. It is illusory to think that we can do this alone. The process is not a one-way street. And it isn't simply having international students here and Americans studying abroad. My hope is that if you truly want to create an international community among the undergraduates at Columbia, that we will be forced to expand the undergraduate population to be able to include more and more international students. Because you don't want to include international students at the expense of offering this extraordinary opportunity to American students. But it is that notion of constant engagement, not simply engagement in a particular course, in a particular classroom, or on a particular trip to another part of the world. So for me, the goal is to create an environment in which an undergraduate student, be they American, be they European, be they Asian, be they African, will feel completely and totally at home in at least two different cultures of the world. So that in a sense, as an American, if you wanted to live with your family in Istanbul, it would be totally simple. You would know the culture, you would know the language, you would know how to navigate within that environment in an exceedingly positive way. And for Turkish students coming to New York, the hope is that New York will always be their home in a very real way. We have to take seriously that while we still obsess over the nation state, those notions of individuation and separation through nation-state borders is becoming increasingly blurred in this world economy, the realm of international communications, and a growing desire to collaborate educationally. And again, I think I will end by reiterating what President Spar said. We do have something very special in the model of liberal arts education. And we begin to move closer and closer to key universities in this regard. Sciences Po in Paris, for example, has set up a whole series of satellite campuses in addition to the Paris campus. And for their undergraduates, they now offer a BA degree, not the traditional French licence. They offer tracks in English. And the natural outcome of that is that we now have a dual BA program between Sciences Po and Columbia, where students will do 2 years at Sciences Po, 2 years here, and get 2 undergraduate degrees. That's one model of engagement. But it needs to be collaborative, in which we deal with one another as equals, yet challenge one another to expand your horizons in terms of the potential of education to facilitate world engagement. Thank you very much.
And Dean Michelle Moody from the college and the Vice President.
Actually, it's Michelle Moody Adams, but here we are. I'm delighted to have been included in this wonderful event. Globalization really is an issue that we all need to be very effective about and to make sure we understand the full depth of the commitments we are signing on to. I happen to believe, and I'm going to speak now as a philosopher, which means I'm going to be prone to at least one or two abstract generalizations, but I happen to believe that the best and the most defensible educational system from kindergarten, or you could even say from preschool all the way to graduate school, is a system that strikes a balance between the local and the global. And when I say global, even though there are many other things that might be meant by it, I mean those aspects of human experience with regard to which we are interdependent across local boundaries. And I'll say a little bit more about that. I think it's important because it's only by preparing people to be both local and global that we will make them happy and productive citizens in this very complex world we inhabit. The great communitarian philosophers, people like Alistair MacIntyre and Michael Sandel, for those of you who are counting, will have said some interesting facts that help us understand why local. They argue that it's impossible to develop certain capacities of intelligence and human agency unless these capacities are initially developed in a local context. But they have their critics, and those critics typically called cosmopolitans, and there are any number of them, I think, doing quite wonderful critical work, caution us about the dangers of too narrowly circumscribing the boundaries within which our capacities have to operate. They urge, these cosmopolitans, that there is a whole host of problems with regard to which human beings are indeed interdependent in substantive ways, and that because of that, our capacities, intellectual, volitional, and moral, need to be developed in such a way that they can be extended beyond the bounds of the local. And I think this is crucial, not just for people who end up in places like Columbia and Barnard, but for people across the globe, wherever they're educated. And we could think of some of the standard examples. There will be more, but I think about the challenges of finding possibilities for a peaceful existence in a nuclear age, or trying to resolve the problems of global climate change, or trying to ensure the conditions of genuine public health in a very complex world in which the things that somebody does on one side of the planet, maybe spewing oil into important waters, might produce fish or food that might in some way endanger the health of others. And so this is a picture of the balance between the local and the global that we must strike. I made the suggestion that the maturity of the student should determine how global you are, and obviously this means that the mission of the university quite naturally has to have a very powerful global component. And so my view of education thus echoes a view, I think, nicely defended by John Dewey in a wonderful 1897 essay called My Pedagogic Creed. Sounds a little old-fashioned, but I think, in fact, we can give it a wonderfully newfangled twist. He says, the best education is the one that produces a student, and I quote, who can share in the intellectual and moral resources which humanity has succeeded in getting together. Note he said humanity, not the West. And by that he means a student who becomes an inheritor of the funded capital of civilization. So what is it that gives us access to this funded capital? We obviously appreciate, I think, that it's the movement of people and ideas across familiar, usually national boundaries. And it's this movement that can make possible a complex national economy. And I don't want us to be too smug about our own position in the modern world. This kind of movement didn't begin recently, whatever we like to think, and it didn't begin only in the late 19th century, as Dewey was writing. In his book on the Great Brain Race, some of you may know this book by Ben Wildavsky, we're reminded that as early as the 12th century, the first Western universities in Paris and Bologna gave rise to a certain kind of internationalization, with students moving various paths to find their way to these great centers of learning. I'm a philosopher, not an historian, so I'm going to skip forward several centuries and point out that it was the fascination of American scholars with the rise of the German university that in the mid-19th century helped to give rise to our contemporary model of the American Research University, Cornell, Johns Hopkins, the University of Chicago. Obviously, the movement of people and ideas continued and intensified throughout the 20th century, and we all know that it's waxed and waned with various economic crises, and certainly in response to various man-made horrors and catastrophes as well. But I have no illusion, as I stand here, that beginning in the late 20th century, the balance, the global balance of economic and political power began to change, and that it began to do so in a way that meant that the knowledge economy began to take on a very different character from what it had had in earlier generations. And I think this is the moment we are confronting now. If you read Wildavsky, which I think you should, I think he's right to argue that there is now a truly global market in students and scholars, as well as in the ideas that those students and scholars develop and circulate. And he points out, and I think rightly, that the existence of this global market has dramatically changed the landscape in which people and ideas cross academic and intellectual boundaries. So given this changed landscape, right, this globalization now is not the same as the internationalization you would have found in the 12th century. Given this changed landscape, this truly global knowledge economy in which students, scholars, and educational students must function, how should an institution with academically rich experiences of its own encourage more academically rich and valuable experiences abroad? How do we do this and also strike the right balance between the local and the global? I'm going to take a few minutes in the remainder of my remarks to pose 5 what I call subsidiary questions and try to give some brief, I hope stimulating, and I even hope provocative answers. So question 1, are we providing opportunities for educational experiences abroad in the right numbers? And are the opportunities sufficiently varied to meet new demands and develop new interests? And I think the 3 panelists here today would agree that probably the answer to that is a resounding no. Now, Columbia College already has 25 to 30% of its students engaging some kind of institutionally sponsored experience abroad. It's not just the typical study abroad program, add in summer study, research, internships, alternative spring breaks, and so forth, and you get a pretty good number doing this. But is it enough? My argument, and the argument of my fellow panelists, is no. I think we need more academically rich co-curricular experiences, more attention to things like civic engagement, as well as classroom and laboratory study, internships and research. We must acknowledge that different students have different needs. We heard earlier about scientists possibly needing different kinds and even different lengths of experiences. Not all of them, perhaps, although Dinon may not like this, not all of them perhaps in the language of the country in which they go to study. We should be working also, I think, some more unusual experiences. It's tempting to think, let's send student X to country A. Why not take students X and Y from 2 different institutions? I'm thinking here Oxford and Columbia, for a program I'm hoping myself to help develop, and send them together to a 3rd institution to engage in a common project. My hope is that we'll be able to enlist the efforts of some of our people in the global centers, perhaps particularly in Mumbai and Nairobi for this. And finally, for this first question, I think we've got to do a better job at encouraging reflective exploration of the experiences our students have, so it integrates them and their experience more fully with the academic experience at home. We don't do right now, I think, a very good job of what I call intellectual repatriation. So, question 2. Should we require or expect every undergraduate to have an experience abroad? And this is a really very interesting question. One of the most extraordinary experiences I've had as Dean of Columbia took place in a wonderful conversational exchange I had at the French consulate with the very visionary president of Sciences Po, who was mentioned earlier, an institution that has now developed a model in which they expect each student, in fact, to study abroad. And I think it's a very interesting idea to ponder. I don't think it's the model, however, that we want at Columbia, and I have 3 reasons. The first is I think not every course of study demands or even appropriately can absorb the kind of work that might be done away from the home institution. Sometimes electronic communication, textbooks, and so forth may be a sufficient supplement, a global supplement in those cases. There may even be people for whom the abroad experience is the right thing, but maybe they're not ready for it during their 4 years at Columbia. Does that mean we need a 5th year? That's an open question. Does it mean it might be a postgraduate experience? That's another possible answer. Thirdly, I think people will sometimes say that the global experience is necessary as a way of waking people up, shaking them out of the unfamiliar. But if you're looking for something to shake the familiar up in the students, we're fortunate that in New York City, we've got enough of that just a little bit down the block outside the gates of the Morningside Heights campus. And sometimes it even comes at us in an unfamiliar language. I would even add that since we have to go on living next door to them, it's a little harder to treat the unfamiliar as somehow impenetrable or an essentially different cultural other than it might be if we unreflectively insist that everybody has to go abroad to experience the unfamiliar. Question 3. How can we continue to affirm our confidence in the continuing value of the Columbia undergraduate experience, even as we celebrate the importance of more global experience? And I don't actually have to do this because it's been done for me, but I obviously celebrate the robust liberal arts and sciences education provided by the Columbia. It is indeed one of the remarkable jewels in the crown of higher education. We do indeed welcome the visitors from other countries who want to know how we do it. It offers access to the best traditions of human thought and culture, and it does this in ways I think that don't narrow the range of the culture in that study. So we have recently introduced, I think rightly, a requirement to have study in what we call the global core. And even if this is not a substitute for the global experience abroad, it is a way of saying that this liberal arts experience we think is important should include something of the global. And then I will say one further worry I have. This experience we've got does in our home environment embody certain values, academic freedom, respect for individual difference, for two, that we can't always ensure our students will find abroad. That's not a reason not to send them, but it is not a negligible concern that it is harder to ensure access to those values when we send them abroad. Question 4. As we think about what it means to send our students abroad, are we aware of some of the dangers to which they might be subject and about which they must be educated carefully before they go? Value 1 that I worry about is the challenge of continuing to embody respect for diversity and equality. A student who is openly gay needs to know that he or she may be ostracized, or even worse in some cultures. A woman who wears a veil as an expression of religious commitment needs to be educated about the challenges of studying abroad in a place that thinks of itself as needing to make the secular definitive of public culture. And I'll give an example a little more personal than I had intended, but a student from some minority groups may not be able to suppose the same kind of cultural commitment to equal access afar. Now, I can say in my own case, that didn't stop me in the late 1970s from going abroad and doing what was still one of the most extraordinary things I've had the privilege to do, and that's get an Oxford degree. But as we think about the values we embody here in the Morningside Heights campus, are we sure that we are ready to ask our students to put their commitment to those values on hold as we urge engagement with other cultural assumptions. I would add, our defense of academic freedom and openness of ideas is not just a negligible thing to be put aside. We have to at least engage our students in a discussion about the stretch culturally and politically they will have to make as they engage in or even contemplate study abroad. So now I come to my fifth and final question, and maybe it's even the most provocative of all. As we value the global, have we done enough, I would ask, to ensure that our valuation of the global doesn't overtake some of the most important lessons of the late 20th century? And frankly, one of these lessons, for me, one of the most important, is a change in the way we thought about international development when we sent people from the developed world, in quotation marks, to the developing world. We argued that there would be lessons that would come out of your engagement with the other that would be importantly local, not global. There is local knowledge to be gained and gleaned from going abroad. And I worry, my question comes out of a worry, that some ways of talking about globalization, about giving students a global perspective, forget that a global perspective is always a perspective from somewhere, and that going to study in country X is not necessarily going to give our students global knowledge. And frankly, that is not a bad thing. We must not forget that no institution and no society, at least in the current moment, particularly institutions of higher education, could possibly exist unless they had a local character. When you think about institutions of higher education, this is local in an economic sense, even in a time of diminishing public support for higher education. The institution that hopes to be global or to welcome the global other will always at the same time be local. And indeed, I ask, can Columbia, and I know it's been brought up as an issue already, can we ever be anything but an American institution with an interest, a rightful and important interest, in balancing local and global knowledge? In other words, should we be cautious not to let the anxieties that have grown up around the global lead us to demean the local knowledge that may be valuable to domestic and international students alike? I think that to do so, to demean the local at the expense of the global, would be to produce an educational system that lost the balance we need to produce a sustainable future for us all. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate the coherence of the panel. That obviously doesn't mean you don't have a lot of questions to raise, but at least it's reassuring to know that on the core issues, there's a great deal of coherent similarity across there from speaking their different perspectives, and certainly including the last point, which in effect is also the one that Deborah started with. Whatever this word does mean, and we certainly thus far in the stuff I'm working on have avoided trying to define it, but we do know that globalization is not the same thing as homogenization. And indeed, one of the reasons we need the experience is to make sure we do not think that globalization means homogenization. But we do know that it means there are fewer and fewer parts of the world or parts of our life which are insulated from things that are happening elsewhere. And somehow getting ourselves positioned as an educational institution in a world which is increasingly not insulated from itself, not interdependent, and yet at the same time is not necessarily experiencing that interdependence in the same way, is exactly the kind of education that we're going to have to design. The other quick thing I would say, and again, just amplifying what's already been mentioned, it's happening everywhere. It's not just happening at Morningside Heights. And when I mean everywhere, I don't just mean everywhere in the United States. I mean, every university that I've paid attention to in the last several years, and that includes in Australia, that includes in China, that includes in India, that includes in Africa, that includes et cetera, also thinks of itself as transforming in a globalization direction. That is, it's not just us reaching out, it's all kinds of people reaching to us. And one of the ways I sometimes describe what I think we're about is there is already an internationally established or globally established scholarly community. And one of the things that we're doing is simply making it easier for our faculty and research part of our life to go participate in that. And there's also a huge flow of students around the world. We get a lot of them, but we certainly don't get all of them. They're going to all kinds of places. The Erasmus program in Europe is way ahead of anything that we are ourselves engaged in with other parts of the world. So when we talk about it, we don't at all mean that it's something we are inventing. It really is something we're joining. And that's one of the ways in which we kind of are conceptualizing the strategy. Well, that's certainly enough for the moderator. We're going to turn directly to Q&A from the audience. Please, sir.
Hi, I'm Adam Quinton. I'm an adjunct at CEPA, and Deborah Spar in her remarks brought up the vexed subject of financing, and I'd like to just ask Deborah if she would to elaborate a little bit more on the first of her observations or predictions. I forget quite how you described them, where you said that you thought the US financing model was less sustainable over time. And I'm wondering if, in particular, behind that, there's a thought on your part that there could be an eventual tipping point at which the fee structure in the US rises to such a level that it creates a material disincentive for students to come to the US, a much greater incentive to stay, perhaps in their lower-cost, state-funded educational institution in whatever country it happens to be, particularly in the context of a global educational system which is seeking to attract students. So the bottom line is, are we close to a point where that trade-off could work to the US's disadvantage, so we have less imports and maybe even create more exports as even US students look to arbitrage the fee structure and go abroad some more?
Thank you for the question. And again, I'll try not to be too pessimistic here, but I suspect everyone in the room knows the basic numbers here. The price of an undergraduate tuition at American colleges has been growing at double the rate of inflation for the past 25 years. That's a very scary graph to see. And this is always the time of the year as students are going through their various acceptance letters, when the newspapers are full of stories. There's one on the back page of the Times Education Supplement just this past weekend saying the increase in U.S. College tuition prices is just unsustainable. Now, people have been saying it's unsustainable for about 10 years, and yet we keep sustaining it. And I think that's in part a good thing. I think particularly at places like Barnard and Columbia, we really do offer an incredible education, an education that is worth an awful lot, whether or not you can put a numerical value on it. However, we are reaching the point, and I apologize, I don't exactly remember the numbers, but the number of families in the United States who can afford tuition of $50,000 is something on the order of 5 or 10%. It's a teeny tiny sliver of the American population. We don't have good numbers here, but anecdotally speaking, if you look at the waves of non-American students who are still coming to American colleges, they are more or less the elites of those countries. That's something we're very worried about at Barnard. We are seeing a massive surge in interest from non-American students, but we don't have enough financial aid to begin to even approach the numbers we're seeing. This worries me a great deal. And I just think if you project forward, and of course China is always everybody's favorite example of everything, but China is building dozens, if not hundreds of universities right now every year. And they are high-quality universities, and the state, for better or worse, is funding them. There will always be a number of wealthy Chinese families that will want their children to be educated abroad, but I suspect that balance is going to shift as the Chinese universities increase in both number and quality. Finally, we are already starting to see, if you will, the balance of trade begin to move slowly in the opposite direction. Again, I don't have the numbers, but I believe the applications from U.S. students to McGill University are growing at double digits every year. They are at Edinburgh University, at St. Andrews. A lot of American families are starting to look outside their borders, and part of this may be that we are becoming more global. These are kids who have traveled more, they've been outside the United States. I think it's something we should just be wary of and not be too arrogant in presuming that the advantage we have, and I do think we have a substantial advantage in the quality of our education at the moment, is going to last forever.
Can I just add a quick remark? The college is now at approximately 17% international students, and this is an interesting moment for us. We have one of the most generous financial aid packages in the country. I don't know how long we can sustain it. I hope we can sustain it forever, but I agree with Deborah that it is clearly a challenge. And the one real challenge for us is that given the limited pool of financial aid available, we do have a need-blind admissions policy for domestic students, but a need-aware policy for international. And that may itself come under pressure as more international students become interested. And I think we're still on the upswing. I know it may stop, but we're still on the upswing. I don't have the figures for the most recent admission cycle since it's still all being tabulated. But that need-blind, need-aware distinction, I think at some point will make a difference to the readiness of families to think about sending their children here. And it certainly does mean that a very large percentage, and they're welcome at the college, but a very large percentage of our students do come from very well-advantaged families. That's true. They certainly contribute a lot to the college, but it would be nice if we could be as diverse in our international body as we are in our domestic.
And I agree that you really have to see it as a two-pronged challenge. In a sense, we're pricing ourselves out of existence. And worse, our ability to increase the financial aid pool, given the economic climate, has become more and more difficult. And so the fear, obviously, out there is that both for the American and international students who we have, will begin reflecting the most pernicious aspects of the current American economy, where the richer are richer and the separation of the rich from everyone else, the gap is now growing and growing. And were that to be the case, in a sense, we then become irrelevant in terms of the broader American society. Now, that's extreme. I think Columbia College is one of the, and Barnard, are some of the exceptions to the rule, but most private colleges and universities do not have the same available resources. And they're the ones, I think, that will be hit hardest in this two-pronged dilemma.
My name is Jack Kahn. Since it is desirable that undergraduates develop some kind of global outlook, and since it's a given that most undergraduates will not be able to study abroad, is there any development of a relationship with the undergraduate divisions, between the undergraduate divisions and the School of International and Public Affairs?
Some long-standing relationships. I know that unless I'm really off, I'm only at Columbia 2 years, but I'm sure that our students take courses in SEPA. Yeah. I'm fairly sure, so yes, there are. And our students are very actively involved in various kinds of internship programs that take them abroad as well, even when they can't count on money to fund them to study. Say during a summer time, they do get money from the college. They do get their regular financial aid for study abroad during the academic year. So that challenge does not face students in the college. But if they want to do other sorts of activities, they can have a range of things open to them. And yes, they do take courses at SEPA, absolutely.
I think the faculty at SEPA is heavily arts and sciences faculty in the political science department, the economics department. And so the undergraduate students have access really to the same level of expertise. And then through the regional institutes, the undergraduates can engage not only one another, but visiting faculty, international graduate students, and I know I'm not sure Barnard has a similar program, but we have an accelerated program of a bachelor's as well as a master's with SEPA, deliberately for people who want to, very, very distinguished students who really want to go on in the field professionally.
Let me just add quickly, I don't think the only way for undergraduates to get an international experience is by going abroad. And I think there are many ways in which we can use technology, literature, movies, roommates to give, in many cases, a very deep experience that could be even more beneficial than some of the study abroad experiences.
Hi, my name's Melissa Im. I'm currently a senior at Columbia College, class of 2011. First, I have to thank President Spar. I have actually 5 of the students in the VISPA program in one of my courses, and we've shared meals together, celebrated Chunjie, and it really is an experience where students are interacting one-on-one with these particular students, so I'd say that's a success. Continuing on that one-to-one, people-to-people relation, just recently, Secretary Hillary Clinton and Councillor Liu presented a program called the Consultation on People-to-People Exchange. Now, this is specifically for U.S.-Chinese relations, but it has 3 particular parts, which is, women's studies, science and technology, and specifically education. And I'm wondering, in terms of programs like this and other programs that maybe peer institutions are doing, how is Columbia kind of combing through what already exists and joining on to these programs? And a second part of that question is, how can students get involved? How can we provide feedback and or give our knowledge? I know all of us are reading up on these particular programs, if not pioneering them. Who should we go into the university?
Well, first I want to say I think a lot of the efforts of students to, in fact, pioneer programs are just as important as the things that come officially from some government official. And Melissa, you were part of such a program. Wonderful student activity through the Ivy League. A group of students formed a council of student leaders who have gone abroad to China and who have invited leaders from China here. And I understand this is an exchange that you hope to continue back and forth. So I think that's that's one route into the kind of engagement students need. I must say that I don't know that Columbia has had an official part to play in the initiative you described. It's not something that there may be one of our folks in the room who would know, but I don't think we've had. It certainly sounds like an interesting possibility. Bring it to our attention, and we'll see what we can do.
Just add a bit on your question. Just an anecdote, but I was visited the other day by 8 undergraduates from the School of Engineering who said because of the constraints of our curriculum, it's very hard for us to go abroad, but we want to. Can you put together, or help us put together a program that would start on December 14th and end on January 16th? And I said, we'll try. You have to get permission from the school. I don't do that, but I can certainly help facilitate that. And it now looks like they will be going to Mumbai during that period next year. I really want to emphasize that because the pressure from the students in terms of the kinds of experiences they want will have an enormous consequence as this whole system unfolds. It's not just going to be some administrators sitting in a room inventing things. You're going to put pressure on your fellow students to join you. In turn, you're going to go find faculty who would like to engage that, and then we're going to hear about it. And it's our job to help facilitate it. But do not think that the creativity is simply going to come out of people, well, certainly these 3, yes, but I mean...
I agree with Ken. I think it's also important that the group that has not been given sufficient mention in this discussion is the faculty who will be the best creators of curricular innovation. and it can't be imposed from top down. It won't be sustainable if it isn't coming out of interest they have. And student pressure is important. I'm enough of a child of that era to think it's important, but it can't be everything if you want sustainable change. It has to be also an engagement with faculty and their sincere intellectual and research interests.
Just one thing on the State Department program, if I could. Barnard has just signed an agreement with the State Department, along with the other sister colleges, specifically to focus on women in public service. So there will be a kickoff colloquium in September that we would love to have as many students, faculty, alums come to. The kickoff program will be at Bryn Mawr, and then there will be a follow-up Summer Leadership Institute, possibly hosted at Barnard. We're working on that. Aimed, details to be worked out, but really thinking about how to use the educational system from U.S. colleges, in this case from the women's colleges, but really to attract women into public leadership from the world, particularly the developing world.
And I'm just, again, going to add one other fact with respect to the students and so forth. Every global center has a faculty steering committee. That faculty steering committee is made up of representatives from every school, from Barnard, from Teachers College. Our website is currently being developed, but some of those faculty steering committees are already listed on the website. At some point, all 7 of them will be. Therefore, you will know, and they include, obviously, arts and sciences, and I say faculty from all parts of the university. So no matter where you are, where you sit, that would be one of the groups that you could start making your voice heard to. Thanks. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. My name is Henry Nass. I'd like to mention to President Spar that my late mother, was an alumni graduating 70 years ago from Barnard, 42. And I have a question for you. In addition to the list of connected things that would help some student become more global, would you add philately, stamp collecting?
It's a fabulous question, and I've never thought of it.
Well, I'll leave you to think about it, because I'd also like to ask...
Thank you very much.
Can I ask you just one short question?
All right, but only one more, because you got to ask questions this morning. I have many hands out here.
Okay. During that period of, December 16th to January 14th, when the engineering students would like to get a more world experience, do you think putting together a course on stamp collecting international might be a good idea?
Well, in that particular group have designed for themselves what they would like to study, and I do not believe that's on the list.
Okay. Thank you.
Please.
I'm visiting New York from Japan this week. Just a simple question. In Japan, a term globalization is often interpreted by many as being a colonization or invasion from English-speaking world or Anglo-Saxon world. How would you counter-argue that?
I think that's a real danger. I mean, there is no doubt. I mean, with all of these different models we've been proposing, even with what I think is a very nimble model, the one of the centers, I can point you to faculty who say this is another neo-colonial enterprise. We should simply be building relationships with other universities around the world. Why do we need to have a footprint in a different society, given the history of American and European incursions into so many different parts of the world? So that's an exceedingly legitimate question that we have to be facing at every level here. I think exactly as my colleagues, all of them have alluded to, you know, there's a real danger when you export a campus and an educational system in giving the impression that, well, of course we're better than you are, that what you do is really not something we take overly seriously, and first of all, we don't know that much about it anyway. And so I think that the temptation of the earliest phase of this process was to go and have a major footprint overseas. And I just think that model is showing a certain amount of wear and tear for a lot of reasons, one of them that you raise. And so it really is a challenge. And I think as we try to engage more, we have to be able to demonstrate that the day-to-day lives of students on this campus is engaged more with the world and with people from around the world than just simply saying, oh, we've got these centers and you can go do something there.
Paul Martin from Barnard College. I've worked internationally for many, many years, and when I listen to the descriptions, I want to underline what Peter just said, this problem of a sense of elitism. Because who are our friends overseas? You know, the rich universities. And so the question becomes then, what about the poor universities? Are they part of the operation? And at this stage of the game, I think we should not forget that right at our doorstep is Haiti. And there are institutions down there that really need support. So it's all very well if we have an outpost down there, but the real question is how do we build the capacity of other universities? And I, in fact, have had these discussions between my students and students in Ghana live on teleconferencing. And the comments all the time by the Ghana students were, you're setting the agenda. We oppose that because you're raising questions in our society, in this particular case, single-sex marriage and abortion, that we don't have a problem with. But once you raise them, it polarizes us. So there's a whole set of questions then becomes, who are the interrogators? Who are we dealing with in these other societies? Or are we simply going out there, you know, with our institutions, with our power, with our money, etc., like that? So I think capacity building at institutions overseas seems to be important, and particularly then with regard to academic freedom. That's where we have to think about how we can do better on that score, helping other universities improve their academic freedom.
I'm really glad you brought that up because it's something it should have come up earlier in the conversation. There too, I think one has to be very careful not to fall into a neo-colonial mode of we will train the teachers, but as you know better than I do, one of the massive problems facing the higher education system, in fact all of the education system in places like Africa, is just a massive dearth of teachers. Teachers at the high school level who might prepare the kids for college, and university professors. And I, several years ago, was trying to do a joint program with the University of Ghana, and we ran right into the massive obstacle that the average professor there was teaching classes of 900 students. And much as they would have liked to partner with us, they simply didn't have the time. And the problem, it was just a lack of any kind of teacher capacity in the pipeline. And I think it might be a very interesting piece to build into the work we're doing, albeit being careful, again, not to fall too much into the export-oriented neocolonial model.
I would want to make a pretty strong distinction between the neocolonial model and the word elitism. If one means by elitism the kind of quality control that obviously this university practices with respect to both selection of faculty and selection of students, and of course what goes on in the classroom, then we are elitist, depending how you use that term. But one of the issues we are certainly emphasizing around the world, insofar as we are partnering with other universities where our students are going, and we're now partnering with upwards of dozens, and that number will grow. We clearly have to make certain that the courses that they're going to be taking there will be of the same quality of the courses that they're taking here, else they can't get a degree. And I would say that some American universities are not following that practice. And they have degraded their degrees because they've allowed their students to go someplace for the experience of being there, but being taught by faculty who simply are not the same caliber of the faculty as we would expect students to be taught here. So it's a real issue. That's a separate issue from whether this university should also be, where asked, in the kind of the development business. And many of our faculty are engaged in those kind of activities. They're engaged in those activities, obviously, through the School of Social Work, through the School of Public Health, through the Earth Institute, and the university as a whole is not a development institution, but many of its activities could be put under that label. And I just alert you to the website of the Earth Institute to see a great deal of that kind of activity. All of which is to say is there are a lot of different ways to be overseas. And nothing as big and complex as Columbia University will be there in only one way. And we do hope that all of the ways in which we're there avoid the problems of neocolonialism, but also avoid the problems of any degradation of the quality of the university that we all belong to. Yep, please, over here. Yep.
Hello, my name is Jennifer Freely. I work for the university, and I also will be graduating from the School of Continuing Education in the spring. Since our environment for graduate students has changed so much that many of us are working full-time as well as going to school, how is it that we are looking maybe to engage in that way, both on a professional and as a student in a global way? Because we work in a global market and we're learning in a global community, and some people, as you said, aren't ready at the undergraduate level, but they may miss that opportunity. So how are we thinking about that?
That's a challenge because we focus our energies, I think, so much on the undergraduate mission. We're not thinking about this. I would imagine some of this is going to be internship-like opportunities that enable students to have, people to have employment. I could talk, for instance, about recent graduates of the college who have gone on to do 1 or 2 year internships with companies abroad. In one case, prefacing the internship work with 6 weeks of study of Arabic at the Amman Global Center, and then going on to do 2 years of work in Dubai. That might be one model, as a kind of quasi-internship, though, because it, you want it to be paid, I would imagine. But I think that's probably going to be the best model.
I would like to let the Dean of Continuing Education give us her perspective.
I'm Christine Billmeyer, Dean of the School of Continuing Education, so I can probably talk to that question, especially in our school. First of all, we are developing the technology that will allow us to integrate communities of students and professionals all around the world. I had the experience of doing that at Penn, actually, for both undergraduate and graduate students. And this platform will be open, social, and participatory, so you will have communities of practice as well as inquiry that will allow this to happen. We also hope to utilize the global centers to take education, which means our students and our faculty, throughout the world to learn as well and share as well as teach. And these would be short-term projects and programs designed for the working professional. That's just a little bit of what we're planning.
Great.
No, I just would emphasize, Christina has been very, very engaged in thinking collectively with us about how to internationalize, globalize, if you will, the experiences of the continuing education students. It's been a remarkable, she's new to the faculty, but she's new to the university, slightly new. But this is the very first thing that she wanted to take up. Please.
Thank you. My name is Alfonso Diaz. I want to take issue with the Dean and the President remark about the study abroad as not being defining experience, that there are substitutes that might as well do, like films, and I wonder, trust me, I was happy, I was lucky of crashing a party, a presentation last week when you brought a group of students who went to South Africa, and I had the opportunity of sharing table with them, and from what you said at that time, I'm not trying to caricaturize your position. I guess that you are all in favor of studying abroad, but with your remark of today makes me raise the issue that Americans are not known throughout the world, particularly for their understanding of foreign cultures and let alone languages and well, a cheap political shot, but that's what explains the emergence of the Sarah Palins of this world.
I'm not even going to try and speculate what would have happened had Sarah Palin done study abroad, but vaguely frightening.
She could see Russia
She
from
could
her
see
house.
Russia. No, let me be clear. I think done correctly, and in most cases it is, study abroad is an incredibly powerful experience because it does give young people an immersion in a culture and a language and an experience and in a peer group that's very different than what they know. I worry, though, a little bit, particularly around the language issue, when I see the number of American students who are choosing to study abroad in English-speaking countries. Now, you can get a phenomenal experience studying in many English-speaking countries, but there's actually been a shift away from Italy, France, towards Australia, English-speaking programs in Spain, English-speaking programs in other non-English-speaking countries. And again, individually, these programs may be phenomenal, but I think they deserve some scrutiny. And at the risk of sounding horribly arrogant, I think less so at colleges like Barnard and Columbia than some others in the U.S. But we did do a review of all of our study abroad programs last year, just to make sure that they were actually about studying abroad, rather than vacationing abroad. Which can also be a useful thing, but you probably shouldn't get credit for it.
I would beg to differ, and I was trying to be provocative deliberately of somebody who studied both in France and in England. I think there is value, first of all, in doing the study abroad experience that's not about a separate language, through cultural immersion that is potentially quite challenging for a person and creates growth. But I would also say that I don't know that a student has to go very far abroad. I will repeat that. If you live in a city like New York, where 150 languages are spoken, at least within the 5 boroughs on any given day, and where there are modes of living that are socio and economically quite diverse from those you might find among students on the Columbia campus, even students who are not that well off. I don't see why, if the aim is to make people sensitized to other modes of living, other forms of experience, I don't see why that can be accomplished only by sending them abroad. I think the danger is that when the other in some way is nearby, I even think this is an issue with regard to how we see Haiti now. It's a little farther away than Washington Heights, but when you think about the experience of an other who might be living just a few blocks away, there's as much of a need and as much of a benefit to one educationally to become immersed in the experience of that other who might not be far away. And I think it can have the same, if that's the reason for the study, to sensitize people to other ways of living. I'm not convinced, even as a person who studied abroad, that you have to go abroad to get that. And that's provocative, I acknowledge. That puts me in a minority, perhaps, but I worry about the attitude we encourage in our students here when we tell them that the other is somewhere else. And you walk out the gates and the other is walking down the street.
It's the spirit of this day that we ask questions, don't necessarily get them all answered. This has to be our last question because we do have to stay on schedule. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm an alumnus of GSAS and enjoyed very much the discussion. I think we have to, it's fair to say there are more problems than solutions, and I think we have to be practical. I think we have to be very realistic about our expectations, and I was attracted to what the professor of Islamic studies said with respect to language and culture. And as somebody who studied abroad and actually developed quite a facility with language, I can tell you that penetrating a linguistic or developing a linguistic capability is not something that everybody finds easy. It's not like learning a computer, it's more like being a musician. And there's definitely a difference between learning a Western European language and an Asian language. I did very well in the first, fell on my face in the second. So I think what you've got to do is design a program, a customized, tailor-made program for to assess a language, the ability, the level of penetration that's possible in a foreign culture. Having worked in a foreign culture and having worked with people who were fellow graduate students at Columbia, I can tell you that a person can come from abroad, get a great education at Columbia, go back to his home country, and there might be very little change in his cultural awareness, certainly, but he's still in his home culture. So I think that we have to be very realistic about the extent to which an undergraduate can be aware of what's going on in a foreign culture, can communicate in a foreign culture, can assimilate what's essential in a foreign culture. These are things that are developed in a lifelong learning pattern. And I think the solution might be assigning tutors to students to be very clear about what their capabilities are and what the task or the objective is, and then just being very practical about it. So I think the professor of Islamic Studies might give us some of his thoughts, additional thoughts on that. Thank you.
Well, you know, again, I'm a pragmatist. One can present an ideal, and I fully agree that language skills are critical. But in fact, the interest in the study of language is very selective. I joke, and this isn't totally serious, but Columbia students follow the money. So you can't have enough sections of Chinese and Arabic, available. Is it because they can't wait to study Arab society and Islamic studies? Well, they see this as a holistic enterprise, and I think that's really quite positive. That if we can shape and help respond to students' interests, we can do a great deal to get them moving in a direction of engagement. But for some students, language training is nigh on impossible or limited. I think we have to have opportunities for them for whatever engagement is available to them. Is that the ideal I would hope for? The answer is no. But to me, the variety of opportunities is really the goal. And again, you know, my 30 years at Columbia, it is extraordinary, the sophistication of the undergraduates on issues of Arab society, the international Islamic world. I mean, they look at me as if I were some kind of artifact from the Smithsonian when I describe my early time here, because things do change. High school curricula have changed substantially. So that by the time they get here, they are considerably more sophisticated students. They go to school with Muslims from when they're 5 years old. That changes people's perceptions. And so there's a lot to be, I think, extremely proud about, but the real challenge is a serious one, and one to which we don't have either the money or all the answers. Excuse me.
But also just to remind you that this is just the start of a conversation. Insofar as this can be on Global Thought, the Global Center Initiative, the East Asian Institute got together, Interact got together, the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, the Harriman Institute, a group of us got together to kind of initiate this. My guess is we will have a series of these kinds of meetings over the next several years, getting deeper into some of these issues, trade-offs between this, that, and the other, and so forth. Fundamentally, what has to happen on this campus is that faculty have got to start organizing workshops and seminars, students have got to start demanding it, people have got to think up new ways to both import and export, what we can do staying on campus. Yes, it makes sense to take some of our students to Detroit who've not experienced that. as a matter of fact. I mean, there are lots of ways in which we get outside of our shells. Not all of them have to require passports. But the university's got a long way to go. On the other hand, and I want to stress this because Lee Bollinger will be here in just a few moments and to talk with 5 undergraduates about this, it is his deep, deep intent to keep pushing us all in this direction. So there'll be more and new kinds of models, new kinds of possibilities and so forth. But we're inviting everyone to sort of join that. But that doesn't mean call me and say, what can I do? That means go do it and then come and tell me what you've done. So thank you.